Chapter 38. Behind us, the lights were flashing. The siren was singing its wee-oo song. Rodeo's hands were clenched tighter on the steering wheel. Jaeger rumbled and grumbled underneath us. We weren't slowing down. Me, Lester, Salvador, Ivan, Gladys, and Val were all shooting each other looks. It was a lot of looks. "Hey, Rodeo," Lester called out. I think he wants you to pull over. Just a hunch." Rodeo didn't answer. He kept driving, eyes on the road ahead. "Rodeo," Val said. "You hear that, right?" Rodeo just shook his head and muttered something to himself. Gladys bleated anxiously. I stood up and walked to the seat behind him. "Rodeo," I said, quiet and easy. "What's going on?" Rodeo said something to me, but he said it so low I couldn't hear the words. "What?" He said it again, and this time I heard him. "I promised you." "Yeah," I said, "we're almost there, so..." "You know how the cops are," he said. "They ask questions, they make us wait, they make calls. It could be hours, honey bear, and I blew it. I gave us no time to waste. We don't have time to stop." "It'll be all right, Rodeo. You were just speeding a little, I bet. We'll get a ticket, maybe even just a warning, be on our way. No biggie." Rodeo shook his head. "I got a feeling about this one, and I promised you." "Sure, but you gotta pull over." The patrol car accelerated and pulled up beside us. The siren was ear-splitting now. "This is the Chelan County Sheriff," an amplified voice commanded. "Pull your vehicle to the side of the road immediately." I felt Lester settle into the seat next to me. We traded worried looks. "Hey, man," he said to Rodeo. "I'm sure he wants you to pull over now, and no offense, but we aren't outrunning him in this old bus." Rodeo didn't respond. The officer repeated his command over the loudspeaker. "Rodeo, listen to me," I said, my voice rising. "If you don't pull over, you're going to get arrested, and then we'll never get there, and you'll have broken your promise for sure. Please, Rodeo, just pull over." Rodeo just swallowed. So I reached forward and flicked on the turn signal. And, real easy, I pulled the steering wheel with one hand, just kind of easing us over toward the shoulder. Rodeo blew out a deep breath, but then he nodded. And he took his foot off the gas and he tapped the brake, and then we rattled to a stop there beside the highway. The cop pulled off on the shoulder in front of us. Rodeo killed the engine. He was looking up ahead at that cop, who was grabbing his stuff and starting to open his door. I saw that Rodeo's hand was shaking. The cop rapped on the bus door. "You know, some folks look like they start the day already half pissed off. This particular officer of the law looked more like he started at a solid 3/4. Rodeo jerked the door open and the cop stepped slowly up the stairs, one hand resting ready on the butt of his gun and his eyes darting quick around. In his other hand, he held a crumpled piece of paper. "Good morning, sir," he said to Rodeo, and there wasn't a word of it that sounded sincere. "Morning, officer. Is there a problem?" The cop was taking his time, climbing up all cautious, and he hadn't gotten to the top step yet where he could see us all. He stopped, trying to peek over the railing, his hand still down by his weapon. "How many passengers you got on board, sir?" "Counting animals?" "Excuse me?" "Well, we got 5 people and 1 goat and 1 cat. If you count animals as passengers, which I would in these particular animals' case, then I guess the answer is 7 passengers in total." The officer's eyes narrowed. He stayed put on that second from the top step. "Any minors on board?" "Yes, sir. 2 minors on board. Coyote here and Salvador in the back." "Any weapons?" "No, sir. Was I speeding, officer?" "Nope," the officer answered and stepped up to the top step. He looked toward the back, taking in Jaeger and her crew. If I was forced to describe the look on his face in one word, I'd have had a hard time deciding between nauseated and hostile. "I thought you said you had 5 passengers." "I said 7, Rodeo clarified, counting Ivan and Gladys." "Well, I'm only seeing 4. Rodeo and I both turned and looked. There was Lester beside me, of course. Salvador was sitting back on the couch. Gladys was curled up in Rodeo's bed pile, nibbling at the corner of a blanket. I'm guessing the cop wasn't counting her. "Where's Val?" I asked. Salvador looked at me quick and gave a small shake of his head, but it was too late. I'd let the cat out of the bag. The cop's eyes glittered at me. "Val," he said, and then his eyes slipped to Rodeo and he said, "Don't move." And then he pulled his pistol out of its holster and walked down the aisle toward the back of the bus, gun held down low. My heart thudded and my armpits flushed hot when he pulled that gun out. My mouth went dry. I'm just not a gun person unless it's a water gun, and even then I'd rather just get wet on my own terms, thank you very much. I had a hard time breathing when I looked at the black deadly thing, but I couldn't tear my eyes off of it. About halfway back, the cop stopped. "Valerie Beckett?" he asked. There was a resigned sigh. Then Val stood up from where she'd been crouched behind the throne. She sat down on the throne, her eyes wet and full and downcast. She was hugging herself like she was cold, even though Jaeger wasn't anywhere near chilly. "Valerie Beckett?" the cop asked again, then held up the crumpled paper in his hand and darted his eyes back and forth between it and her. "It's you, isn't it? Are you okay, miss?" Val didn't answer. She just swallowed and looked away. The cop looked back at Rodeo. "And why, sir, didn't you care to tell me about this minor?" "She's 19 years old," Rodeo said, but his voice was kind of thin sounding. "I'm sorry," Val said, and she didn't say it to me or the cop. She said it, her voice cracking right to Rodeo. "Oh, no," Rodeo said quiet and closed his eyes. "What's going on?" I said. "How long have you been transporting Miss Beckett, sir?" the cop asked, gun still drawn, voice tight. "Since Minnesota, sir, but she told me—" "Minnesota? Are you aware that it's against the law to transport a minor across state lines without their parents' permission?" "She told me that her parents reported her missing 2 days ago. They suspected kidnapping. Then her cousin said she got a call last night. Said this young lady was on her way to meet her in Seattle, riding in an old school bus. We've all been looking for her." "I'm sorry," Val said again, and Rodeo just sat there with his eyes closed, and I said, "What's going on?" again, but it was like no one could hear me. The cop backed up so the wall was behind him and he could see all of us. "Is anyone else here against their will?" he asked. "I'm not here against my will," Val protested, her voice small. "Officer, I told them that I was—" She was cut off by a crackle from the radio clipped to the cop's uniform. He snapped it free and held it up to his mouth. "Dispatch, this is Griffith. I have that Minnesota girl from the APB here in custody, and I have apprehended the suspect as well. We're on Highway 4 westbound at mile marker 108. Please send backup. Over." Rodeo shook his head, but it looked more like defeat than argument. "Officer," he said, finally opening his eyes, "no one is here against their will. Val told me she was 19 and That'll be enough, sir. I'm going to need you to go ahead. Stand up nice and easy and put your hands in the air." I gasped and jumped up to protest, but I saw the cop stiffen and tighten his grip on the gun. And Rodeo looked at me in the eyes and said quiet but firm, "No, honey bear, don't. It'll be all right." And then, with just about the saddest eyes you could imagine, that heartbroken hippie stood up slow and careful and put his skinny arms up in the air like he was some sort of criminal. Lester put his hand on my arm, and it was just as quiet as Rodeo's voice and just as firm. "Nobody move now," the cop said, and then he made his way up to the front. "Turn around, put your hands behind your back," he said when he got up to Rodeo. And he clipped his radio back to his uniform and pulled a pair of handcuffs off his belt, real honest-to-God handcuffs. Rodeo blinked, and then Rodeo, that crazy, beautiful, ridiculous freak, he looked that cop right in his eyes. Rodeo turned those magical eyes of his on the cop, looking right past his drawn gun and dangling handcuffs, and just looked him right in the eyes. "Please," he said, "this is all a misunderstanding, I swear." His voice was tender, his face open, his eyes magnetic. "Please, I made a promise to my daughter that we'd get to where we're going, and a promise is a promise, right?" He smiled a little when he said that, just a little. "Please?" Rodeo turned those magical eyes of his on that cop and just said, "Please?" The cop stopped looking into Rodeo's eyes, and then the cop smiled. "Well, I didn't realize you made a promise to your daughter, sir," the cop said, and Rodeo's small smile grew. "And I couldn't care less," the cop continued. "Turn around, put your hands behind your back, and do it now, or I will forcibly subdue you. And quit staring at me like that." I guess magic doesn't work on some sorts of folks. "You can consider that promise broken, buddy. You aren't going anywhere, and neither is this bus or anyone on it till we get to the bottom of this. Y'all are done traveling today, and you are under arrest." So that's what happened. Rodeo's smile faded to nothing, and he shuffled in a circle and put his hands behind his back, and the cop took his keys and slapped the handcuffs on, and I just sat there watching. It didn't seem real. It didn't seem like it could actually be happening. It was, though. Rodeo turned to look at me, and his eyes just about tore me apart. "I'm sorry," he mouthed, and I just nodded. The cop said all those words about the right to remain silent and all that jazz. Then he walked Rodeo down the steps and barked at the rest of us to follow him. Our quest was over, 8 miles short.